for last semester, this semester, full of trainings. Some interesting positions. So, as I mentioned, I think we'll just look at this for about 20 minutes, and then we can go to whatever other discussions are going to be happening here. As I mentioned, I made that little booklet, which I brought 2 copies just for you all to have here. Your accents or Asian it's an American thing. We don't say that in Canada. But so I'd say just probably everybody here saw what happened, but the story. I would just provide sort of or highlight a few of the historical points that led to the strike, some background. So a lot of the demand, or let's say one of the key demands for the strike that happened in Quebec was rooted around a period in Quebec's history called the Quiet Revolution. It's called the Révolution Tranquille. So that's the tranquil revolution, I guess, or quiet revolution in English. But in reality, the Quiet Revolution wasn't very quiet. I don't think that term is super accurate. It was a period of intense social upheaval in Quebec society. And I'd say one of the central points of that period was sort of the assertion of the political and linguistic rights of the Quebec population, the French-speaking population. So basically, prior to the late 1960s and early 1970s, historically the Quebecois population was mainly working in agricultural sector and in factories. So people were actually quite economically downtrodden, and levers of economic and political power in Quebec mainly were rooted in, let's say, structures that had imposed themselves on Quebec during the colonial era of the British. So a lot of the major corporations that were foundational to Canada, like the Hudson's Bay Company, for example, which was one of the main instruments of colonization, actually, that affected the First Nations, Indigenous populations in Canada, or you could say Turtle Island, in the northern parts of Turtle Island. They also were involved, those companies involved in oppressing culturally and economically the Quebecois population. So there was also a big role of the Catholic Church in terms of imposing a certain dominance or domination culturally on the Quebecois. There's always complexities to any story or any part of history, but I'm just like highlighting a few broad points that at least provide some context to what happened in 2012. So at that time, there was a movement for Francophone universities, because at that point there was only one Francophone university in Montreal, but the majority of students were Francophone. So actually what that meant tangibly was that most French speakers never went to university, right? And never had access to post-secondary education. So during that period, there was many student strikes and actually non-student protests, but people were demanding access to universities. So young people who wanted to study in their language were protesting. And I'll just highlight 2 sort of actions from that period. One was called Operation McGill, which is McGill University. Operation McGill is pretty obvious. That was actually a really intense protest that happened in 1971, where thousands of people converged from the east end of Montreal, which is traditionally more Francophone, and the west end is more Anglophone. And their Operation McGill, which is a lot of that action was supported by labor federations, which at that period were quite radical. They were demanding French access at McGill, because McGill had traditionally, literally there's walls around the campus. It's considered an Ivy League school, I'm sure you've heard of it. And actually even administrative access, like basic administrative access, was only in English. So Operation McGill really forced this intense debate, not only at McGill, but about like French access to university education in French. The only other thing I'll mention from during this period in relation to education was the demand for a French and free university. So that's where the University of Belgium, University of Quebec in Montreal was founded. And that actually was the heart of the strike in 2012 organization. That was like the hub in terms of energy, in terms of analysis, in terms of support from professors, etc. So all that to say that that period in Quebec history is very sort of essential to laying the cultural and political foundations to the strike that happened in 2012. So I know that's not really, wasn't talked about in the media much, so I'm just sort of providing a few points from that period. Obviously it's a huge story, and that's just like a tiny sliver of what actually happened during that period. That was the same time where women's movements in Quebec really asserted themselves very strongly and rebelled against the Catholic Church. That was also the period where unions actually became real unions in Quebec. During that, before then, that wasn't the case. So it was very much an intense period, not unlike other parts of the world during that time. So, but the problem was that during that period, people demanded for the abolition of tuition, and that was like widely supported at that time by the population. But that demand was never met, right? So that demand for the abolition of university tuition never happened. So essentially, the crazy thing is that you could say that the demand for free tuition is sort of an unanswered dream of that period. So that's why there's so much support for it. So there's three major student federations in Quebec. There's the Federation of College Students, the Federation of University Students, and then the Association of Solidarity between Student Unions. So there's two more mainstream ones, the first two I mentioned, which are less oriented to street actions, and then there's the ASE, which you've probably heard about, which is more, not as large, but more oriented towards direct action, towards grassroots mobilization. And so that's sort of the main sort of structures of how students are represented. Now, the Quebec former premier said something during the height of the strike, which I think was very revealing. He said to the government that was sort of voted out after the strike in September, he said, don't dare negotiate with the students because they're anarcho-syndicalists and they will never listen to you because they don't believe in the inherent structure of the state as we understand it. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing. But I think it shows, which is actually accurate, like ASE is an anarcho-syndicalist union. There's members, there's local associations within colleges and university departments, but the decisions are made in assemblies between the local unions, and then there's a national federation where people meet to make broader decisions. So at times the political process is a bit slow, but it's, I think, really interesting and actually quite hopeful as a political structure that includes around 60,000 people and is a long-term structure, but also has a lot of levers of accountability and deep organizing process that are very different from a sort of the other two traditional unions. And the way they function is more like mainstream political democracy in the sense that there's students who run for the leadership every few years and they're elected, and that's sort of the end. And then after that election, those students go off and sort of make their decisions, right? So ASE was sort of rooted in that period of history of Quebec and is a more sort of direct democracy model, and well, essentially it's an anarcho-syndicalist model. The former leader of Quebec was right. So that's the student units. In 2005, there was a strike, and that's sort of important to mention because that's when the Carré Rouge, the Red Square, began. The all in the red, that idea of the Red Square as a symbol. It started in Quebec in 2005. And that was a strike when the Liberal government, which was the government that was in power during the last strike, that's when they first came to office in 2005. And that was the first time in Quebec's history there was ever a neoliberal government elected. So like in sort of the model of, you know, the Chicago School of Economics, sort of the slash public spending to achieve a balanced budget, you know, et cetera. Public institutions are fair game for spending cuts, but, you know, we'll lower corporate taxes, that's going to create jobs, that whole sort of mantra, that absurd mantra. That was the first time in Quebec we ever had a government that fully adopted that sort of discourse and actually started trying to apply it. And I would say after their term, which was between 2005 and 2012, they weren't fully successful. They imposed some things, but not totally. So in 2005, they tried to cut $103 million from the bursary of students. And that's when sort of the sparks of what happened in 2012 began, because students had a strike for 3 months. I was part of that strike in 2005. And that was about fighting back from the sort of austerity-driven cuts to the bursaries program. And so actually the strike won. And the $103 million that had been cut was, that decision was totally rescinded. And so that, I think, really gave people a lot of the political motivation and the hope for what happened in 2012, because they saw that, you know, street mobilization and people power sort of style process could actually get results. You know, so there was that strike in 2005. And then it's a really interesting thing in 2007, the same federation, supported by activists, launched an effort to do a second strike, but this time it wasn't around a specific policy announcement, but it was just a general mobilization for the abolition of tuition. So it was like to basically say we should have no more tuition in Quebec, which is something that quite a few people support in Quebec, like I'd say a significant portion of society. But that mobilization had really strong demos. Like there was one rally of about 25,000 people for that event. But because I think there wasn't a clear target, it didn't take the same route in terms of momentum and energy as the strike in 2005 took, and then later on the strike in 2012. So as I mentioned, the government that was elected in 2005 talked about a cultural revolution. And essentially what they were trying to do was sort of attack all the gains of that period of history in Quebec that I called before, that I mentioned, which was like the quiet revolution or the Révolution tranquille. Because they wanted to basically ensure that all those gains that people made were fought and people, that the government wanted to destroy it, and they called it a cultural revolution. That's literally the term they used. So the 2012 strike really comes from that period. That's when people started talking about an open-ended general strike, was in this period here, 2005 to 2007. And a lot of the literature and the pamphleting and the discussion, like within the activist student community and the more broad activist community, really began in this period. That's when people started saying, oh, well, we hope one day that we want to mobilize for a general unlimited strike. Grève générale illimitée. You probably saw that, so unlimited general strike. That was, so I just wanted to mention that because what happened in 2012, often, you know, we understand things in a very mean, sort of immediate sense, you know, that things happen very quickly in political culture. But I think, like, in reality, well, I was sort of, you know, around the organizing then and saw the discussions beginning, and there's sort of a continuity between what happened in 2005 and what happened in 2012. So it's just interesting to think about in terms of long-term perspective within organizing, you know, that things sometimes don't work. Like the strike in 2007, it didn't actually work technically. There were some great actions, but in terms of an actual major strike, it didn't happen. So, as I mentioned, the ASE, during the strike of 2012, what they did was something very interesting, which is the ASE is, as I mentioned, the Association of Solidarity between Students' Unions. And in order to sort of try to include more groups, so also like community groups and like non-traditional education groups and affinity groups they said that we're actually not going to just be the assay, we're going to be the class. So that meant the large coalition of assay. So you had the assay, which was the traditional union, which represented about 60,000 students. But in the lead up to the strike, there was a decision made to call it the CNAS, which meant, which was great in French because it means class, like economic class. So it meant like class analysis also, but also it just meant that the assay would become large and more inclusive as a structure. And that's when the assembly model was adopted, rather than the more traditional union model. So I'm just mentioning that sort of structurally because I know in New York City there's all those discussions happening around trying to create a student assembly structure in New York. So we can talk about that in more specifics after if you want. So one thing that's important about the assay is they sort of have this idea that they're a traditional union, but it's a combative union. So there's a lot of direct action tactics involved. So it's the strike really announced itself to the world and like the public in March 22, 2012, because that was like the first time that I guess you could say the whole downtown was full of people. Montreal is like the size of Boston, it's about 3-4 million people. So when you have a demo of about 500,000 people, that means like most of the downtown streets are just full. But the thing is that I think what the government hoped was that sort of like theatrical rally where you have like this massive, it's like the rally here in New York City against the Republican National Convention in 2004, or the World Economic Forum in 2002, or Occupy Wall Street was a bit of a longer process, but you have these very theatrical, dramatic, big actions. But I think the very great thing that happened was that there was an understanding that political power won't listen to those pieces of political theater, but that's important, but there also needs to be an effort to actually try to address and impact and confront the economic and political power in society. So when I talk about tactics and actions, what happened was there was called the Semaine Perturbation économique. So it's like the week of economic disruption. So students did very brave actions that were very intense, and I went to some of them. So I'll just give 2 examples. Students went to the Port of Montreal, which is a very important part of the economy in Montreal because it's on the St. Lawrence River. And they blockaded the port for a full day. And students, mainly between about 17 years old and 21, blockaded the port, and they defended themselves with metal garbage can lids and 2x4s. And essentially, a lot of training went into that action, but essentially, it was a defensive, not an offensive push. So, but I think essentially what students were trying to say to the government, because 500,000 people had been on the streets on March 22nd, and the government still was refusing to negotiate the tuition increase. So what the students' unions were saying was that, we're not going to just accept that you're not going to negotiate. We're going to disrupt the economy until you negotiate and illustrate a sense of social crisis within Quebec society so that you're forced to negotiate. So that's why there's the week of economic disruption. There was a history of this. It's not only in 2012 that ASSE had these types of actions, but there was also a blockade of the World Trade Center in Montreal, the Centre Commercial Mondial, but it's like it's not like the World Trade Center was here. But the idea was that the protest was sort of against, like in Montreal, the World Trade Center has a lot of nasty mining companies, and so there's a lot of like statements of solidarity between how this institution, the World Trade Center, is oppressing people in Quebec and students, and they're part of the lobby to try to increase tuition, but they're also the companies involved in that trade center are also oppressing people globally, right? So students were saying, well, actually, what this means in regards to education is that, Canada's really horrific when it comes to mining companies. So many of the companies listed at the Montreal World Trade Center are like these horrendous mining companies. So that literally means, destruction. There's examples in Guatemala and Argentina and Mongolia. It's unfortunately the list is really long when it comes to Canadian mining companies. So when students blockaded the World Trade Center, that for example, that was one thing people talked about. So tactics were intense, and at that point, the government still was refusing to negotiate and instead enforced repression. And that at that point, things were really building. And there was also the big rallies going on, and a lot of groups were forming that were more autonomous groups because there was a huge momentum. So groups like Mère en colère, which is like Mothers Enraged, formed, and that was moms of students. So they would stand between the students and the riot police and say, these are our kids, they want to go to school, they want to access university, and we're going to support them. And there was also Prof Con Exos, which was professors from these colleges who would do the same thing. And so it was sort of really rolling. There was a lot of intense actions taking place. So that's when repression came. And they introduced Law 78. And that was basically van demonstrations in Quebec, period. And you can gather more than 30 people, or else everybody would be arrested. But fortunately, because of this background I was talking about the quiet revolution in Quebec, people didn't accept that. And that's the response within 48 hours, was that people in different neighborhoods, like we're talking in the New York context, like from Bronx to Bed-Stuy to really all over. There was calls, sort of autonomous calls on Facebook, not necessarily by students, some by students, to reject this law that banned demonstrations. So it started because there's a pretty strong cultural link between Latin America and Quebec, and so that idea of the casserole came up. So people started saying at 8 o'clock every night, we're going to reject this law. And by the second day, there was about 12 demonstrations of, between a few hundred to 3,000 people, but not just one, 12 throughout the city. So the police didn't know what to do because everybody was saying, well, we're not going to accept this law. And that really heightened the mobilization instead of repressed the mobilization. But unfortunately, at the same time, the city of Montreal passed another law called P6, which I'll get to in a minute. So all this, this sort of mobilization against Law 78 led to the crisis that you all probably heard about. And basically, that's when the government tried to move the discussion from an uprising discussion into the political realm they could operate in, which was elections. And so that actually really fucked up the movement, I'll be honest, because there was really intense debates because a lot of people are saying this is beyond elections. This is about how our society is run. This is about restructuring society and democratic decision making in communities and so on. But some people said, oh well, we have to vote out this government as a sort of a symbolic victory, and that's what happened. But unfortunately, the government ceded the new government, because the government was overthrown in a sense by the strike, but the new government kept some aspects of what the previous government was trying to do, of course. So all that to say that right now there's this other law that was written during the height of the strike called P6, which is the same law as this one, but they didn't use it during the strike. They were using the national Quebec-wide law, not the Montreal law. So now they're using the Montreal law to try to sort of, I think, reclaim the state's power on the streets and just sort of arrest people at any protest. So there's been almost 1,000 arrests in the last 2 months. And so I think it's a very difficult period actually right now in Quebec, because you had that moment of euphoria and excess and struggle in 2012, but it took that much time to get there, right? 2005 is when people started leafleting for the general strike, and it happened in 2012. So after 2012, I really at all don't think, I totally think the strike was a success in the sense that you have 200,000 or 300,000 people who are totally politicized and now have a sense of political power that didn't exist before, like, you know, power in terms of grassroots power, and went through that whole process together. And a lot of, like, I think neoliberal capitalism had to take a bit of a step back in Quebec because of the strike, but not full step back, you know. So now it's sort of still an open question where things are going to go. So solidarity is important because what happened in Quebec is not like an exception. I think it's like it's part of a specific history, you know. But everywhere has its own history. You know what I mean? Like, for example, in New York City, there's incredible histories of struggle around access to education and access to college in Brooklyn. And, you know, I'm sure you know the history better than I do. But the reason I'm trying to say that is I think often people talk about Quebec as like this exceptional strike. And I just think it's important to really, let's talk about it realistically. What happened? Students started organizing in 2005 for a general strike in 2012. So that's like 7 years of a union working towards that, right? So I'm just saying that to say, like, it's not this like thing that just sort of mystically happened. You know, it's like a process. It's a process. There's tons of flaws. And now we're having like the blowback from the state power and neoliberal capitalism. You know, so I guess the conclusion I would say is that there are some very specific things that I think are important about the Quebec strike structure that I think should be thought about in other places, which are the anarcho-syndicalist student model. There's a few points I would like really assert in terms of being essential to what happened. One is the General Assemblies and the democratic decision making, but also those assemblies were delegated, so they weren't open General Assemblies. People were, each local union would vote to have members that would attend and vote for the union within the broader assembly. And non-students couldn't vote in those assemblies, you know. So that's important to highlight. But sort of it's like very much like a union structure, like a labor union structure, but a combative union structure, not one that's trying to like negotiate with power, but more assert its own power on the streets. So the union structure is important. And then also having staff that's like in terms of thinking about what's going to happen in New York City. Like behind a lot of the sort of exciting stuff of the strike is actually like really sort of rudimentary grunt work, right? Like each local union, and ASSE has about 17 or 18 local unions, had like many hours spent like updating phone lists, keeping email lists going, and having like actually lots of meetings back in 2006 and 7 where fucking 3 people came, you know? So that's sort of the grunt work within unions. And each local in ASSE has a paid staff, and that's paid by student dues. So, and then they have things like a photocopier, which is super important, as you all know, like for organizing action. So each local bureau has a photocopier, right? And it's sort of not like just open access, but it gives people the capacity to like distribute their own information, right? Like, so those are all a few things to think about. I think the last thing I'd say about ASSE, which is important, is that it doesn't align with political parties. Not to say it doesn't negotiate with political parties or the state, but it doesn't align with political parties. So it doesn't allow itself to be sort of represented by political power in terms of traditional politics. It doesn't, I think generally speaking, you can say that ASSE's approach is not to say that we don't have to deal with political power. We do, but it's understood to say that actually we don't want to be represented by that process. We are representing a totally different vision of political power, but we also have to confront with and deal with those structures of power because they exist, right? So it's an anarchist approach, but a more, you know, as I said before, like anarcho-syndicalist sort of approach to things. And I'd say in ASSE, there's not one opinion, right? Like there's fucking hundreds of opinions, right? So, and that's not a bad thing, you know, it's like a giant structure. There's probably about 1,000 people who are really active. So you have socialists, you have communists, you have like art students who are like more surrealists doing like art projects, you know, you have more like insurrectionary anarchist factions. So you have tons of factions. And so I think the other thing about the strike to talk about is that there was that solidarity between those different factions within the left, which is like totally mind-blowing to me, which I thought was really amazing about the strike. So I'm sorry, I don't want to, the reason I didn't want to give like a really sort of flashy talk about what happened in Quebec, because I could do that and I would say, oh, there's this action and it's super inspiring and there's this one, and you know, but it's true. But I also just wanted to talk a bit about the more gritty, like organizing aspects, because you're doing this amazing action now, and I think that's just more of a real. We can have a more real discussion about like what's actually what actually was planned and stuff. That's all. I mean, I left a few of the things here.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Oh,
your agenda and stuff. Super organized. And also it's crazy for me to hear about like such an organized like situation, just because I feel like we are not really organized. Like we're like super loosely organized almost, and different kinds of organization that we've tried like haven't stuck. So it's interesting to hear about the way it was like and I guess also like it feels like when we started to approach more like organized stuff, it starts to feel kind of like a job, or like you know, and like you're saying, like there are actually people that are getting paid to do those administrative type things, which is kind of interesting. But like even just when we tried like parceling out work specifically into like really strict like, or just really cleanly divided like working groups and blah blah blah, like it kind of falls apart under the weight of the organizing, as opposed to like it seems to me like what has happened here for us is just based on like whoever wants to do stuff does stuff, and then they link up with each other. Like it's very like it's like super immersive.
Oh.
So obviously it's not, but it's not the same scale at all, which is super different. Like when you're talking about 60,000 people, I think that's set up with yeah. So like just the scale of 60,000 is like blows my mind, but also like I just can't. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine what kind of structures we could start moving forward, because like the emergent thing is the only thing that seems to work for us so far.
Do you want to go over?
Oh, sorry.
There's just a suggestion. Do you have to say specific means?
No, this is it. Okay. Stefan was going to talk about this more a little bit as like burnout prevention and different also our structural things we usually try and bring them in, but we kind of with this occupation kind of did a lot of preparation going into it, and then kind of just got into it, and then like like Casey said, a lot of it fell aside. Like we had maybe one or two very facilitated meetings with agenda points and about making certain decisions that like needed to be made as a group, and then once we did those, then that structure, when there wasn't as much pressure to make those group decisions, kind of fell back into more casual meetings. I think a lot of the immersion stuff, like Casey said, resonates a lot with us, but also then we end up in this more like casual space where less people are doing more, and not necessarily because other people don't want to do things, but maybe because it's not as easy to plug in. And right now we have probably for like the first time really we have a number of community groups outside of students, current students that are trying to plug in, which include outside students from other schools, faculty, alumni, incoming and prospective students, and parents. And so like for the first time now, it's not only trying to juggle what this group needs to do, but also trying to help facilitate the other groups to be able to participate the way they want to participate. Because a lot of groups want to participate now. And I don't know if structure is the answer, but we're at a kind of point where we need to do something to get past the bottleneck. It seems to be like a little bit like people really want to, like parents really want to organize, like students, and we're doing where we be a little too slow for what other people want to be doing. That's my observation.
The only thing I'd say about that is, I think you'd be having a Sunday
Every Saturday, Sunday, with the other student groups. But that's like, yeah, and that's like, that was before this action, that group started leading up to May Day. So, you know, I think even that group has somewhat of an aversion coming out of Occupy to the idea of assembly. Like, we don't call it an assembly because people have this kind of trauma attached to the idea of an assembly. So like what you're saying about an assembly where only students can vote might be very resonant because like we have a lot of problems with the idea of other people coming in and, you know, wanting to latch on all these other issues which are also related but maybe not as pointed. So that's
I mean, on a very basic level, I think like having assemblies for union students specifically would be something to think about. And then if other autonomous groups want to organize actions, that's great. And they should. But I think also trying to control what the autonomous groups are doing is not also, I think that's when things get exciting, is when sort of autonomous groups are doing things, but not necessarily in your name, but doing things, if it's a broader education issue, if this action inspires that, that's a good thing. But they shouldn't be speaking for you, I mean, this is just obvious points, but like, I think that in Quebec, often, I remember, like in many of those assemblies where it was only student voting happening, right? And actually only as a member of delegates voting, like hundreds of people would show up at the assembly because this was like a crazy thing that was going on. And they would want to have resolutions passed about Canadian mining companies in Afghanistan, for example, right? Which is super important, right? Or migrant justice, which was like, obviously like really important, you know? But some of those things eventually got adopted, but they needed to be proposed through student unions themselves and voted by the students. Because they were, and the answer was often to like other organizations, which was, we'll take this model and run with it. Like, if there should be an assembly of, on whatever issue, like, that would be great, Like, but they weren't claiming to represent the entirety of social movements on the left, right? Those student assemblies. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Which almost happened like this morning, like Casey had to go talk to, like, so we have, because of this occupation, we have like a body of administrators that was called the emergency management team, which is like many different administrators, most of them whose interests lie in making the occupation go away. So that like was called, but that group also included a number of people who are on the more sympathetic end of the occupation, or at least the occupation's goals. And so separately, those administrators created a different body, which they don't call an assembly, but they call the other group called it's right there. They call the bridge group, and the bridge group called itself in order to be a bridge between this body of occupation students and the education and like the president. And actually, Casey had to go this morning and we had to clarify exactly what you're saying, which is that they should take this model that we're doing and run with it, but that they should not be speaking on our behalf because they declared that they were going to be like the intermediary between the students in this space and the president. And we were like, well, actually, we are already in as much communication with the president as we need. So I think it's funny to throw that structure back because that's actually what just happened.
They're like, yeah, it's crazy. We got sent like minutes that are like how to
ending the
It's like,
occupation peacefully.
we're like, but also how to push our goals through like bureaucratic channels. So like the tricky part is like the like Victoria was saying, it's like they want to help, but also they want to diffuse, and in that they end up like speaking for us and serious.
Yeah.
That whole peaceful thing is really dangerous.
Yeah.
The term peaceful, because peaceful means pacification, and non-peaceful doesn't mean violent. Peaceful means that normalcy asserts itself, right? And normalcy means that things side with the structures of power that exist. So that term peaceful will be presented as like a very benign sort of thing, but it's actually a very violent thing. I mean, it's an obvious point, but
No, I think it's important. During Occupy, it came up a lot, conversations about violence and nonviolence, and people usually use them as being opposites, but in my experience, violence and nonviolence are actually not on opposite sides of the spectrum, but rather on like, maybe, yeah, they're just not, they're related, interrelated, but their prefixes don't work the way other prefixes do. Nonviolent doesn't mean peaceful, and so I think that's a very good point, because like, as much as we say we are nonviolent and that we are, most of the rhetoric that has been used to describe the potentiality of this group has to do with riots, and we're very much like the group sitting in an office.
Which I think they realize.
I think they've realized, but like very much like it's always about like de-escalation,
Yeah.
like Casey's saying, how do we de-escalate this occupation? It's like, well,
de-escalate means control.
yeah.
Cooper Union student assemblies.
Yeah. Oh,
And I think the other part that I'm just curious about is like, it seems like we do have like momentum, but like part of it is that it's also just fun to hang out here. Like in a way, it's like for a while people were like wary of like, will I get in trouble? Are they gonna pull my degree?
Yeah.
But now also it's kind of just like this awesome like place where you can hang out, and there's food, and you can also like do this like political work. But I think in my experience, people also get super fatigued when we start to like do meeting structures, and it's like, and we've had a lot of meetings like over the years, but and maybe they could be structured better, but I think fatigue sets in really, really quickly, and even one good meeting, if it's like repeated in a structure, we'll start to see just this massive drop off of people that want to be part of things but don't. I don't know, the assembly thing, like, I want it to work, but I've seen that drop off over and over, so.
Well, you gotta work with what you have, right? And whichever students come to the assembly, maybe figuring out what is for. But, the last thing I'll say, in terms of suggestions, because I'm just keep visiting, obviously. But like, one thing that students did in Quebec, which I think was really great, which was calling for solidarity actions. So when all these people were saying, how can we help the strike? How can we help the strike? Well, there was actually formal appeals illustrated for, communicated for a social strike, right? So that was in the Quebec context. So one thing you can think about here would be like, all these groups are saying we want to support the union, we want to support the union. Well, why not call for a day of New York City actions for the abolition of tuition, for free education, or for the abolition of student debt, or whatever it is, like the debt strike campaign, or like, and have people do autonomous actions, and that could be amazing, like, and say in different areas of the city, do something, and maybe that could be the legacy of your action, right? You could inspire people in other places to do shit.
Important, I think, to talk about how this is a systemic issue bigger than Cooper. In some ways, Cooper's been a really powerful campaign because you're fighting to keep a system in place as opposed to change the system for a lot of other people. But it's important for a lot of people who go to state school, like community schools and other places to realize that their free education was a model. There, it just hasn't been uprooted for a little bit longer than Cooper, so it's not as fresh in people's minds. But that doesn't mean that you can't demand something back, or even if it was never free, you can always shift power. So I think for this campaign to survive, it has to shoot its roots out. I mean, you can stay central to the demands and the issues here, and I think that's really essential, while at the same time, like, that idea of solidarity and autonomy kind of being built amongst the other students. I feel like a lot of people have been, my experiences just from being on the outside or watching a lot of people kind of congregate in front of Cooper, which is great, but they should also be organizing in their own schools or organizing in their own capacities. And to see the different student groups kind of have like a citywide student assembly, which seems to be slowly happening, I think is an essential next step. And also just to touch on really fast about the structures of the school, there was like a quick and very hasty attempt to build a spokes council model and to divide up. We kind of mapped out all of the work that needed to be done in order to sustain the campaign and divided. People volunteered for different things, and then that kind of just like ended. As soon as people were tasked with the responsibility, they said they would do it, and then they met maybe once or twice, and some didn't even meet at all, and then it wasn't taken back. Part of that was poor timing because it was at the cusp of a break. But I'm not quite sure why people said that they would step up and then couldn't follow through. Maybe it's a cultural idea of like the idea that there's so much work to be done at the school. Everyone is so busy finishing things that they weren't able to do this other organizing on top of it, or the inherent risks. So there has to be a cultural shift that this is the work of the school, and like which changes the paradigm of what an institution is and what non-institutional learning is. So there's just a couple of things. But also it's really important for those who have stepped up to do their best to mentor those who are younger and who are coming in, to try to encourage them to take on greater roles in the campaign. Not only to provide ability to the campaign, but also just to kind of, hopefully it will be a force magnifier and multiple groups will expand.
But it's weird to be here and then hear someone else's perspective from outside the school. I know I was talking to my dad yesterday, and he was saying, you know, like a lot of it is people here that get free education, and it's you know, the conversation ends there. It's like they're occupying their president's office, but they get free education, and that sort of is a contrary thing to a lot of people. I think it's like, so I think that's where we're at. I guess maybe trying to convince people that they deserve free education, and that we're not simply defending our own, I guess, what we're doing now.
I sort of feel like within like the last few days, there's just been like a drop off of all always feel like within the last few days, it seems like there's been like intense discussions going on where like people feel very heated about one thing, and then I have no idea that it's even happening. So like I don't feel like I need to engage, which like feels shitty because I do like ordinarily I would want to. But it's like to me it seems like the amount of entry points we had going into this are like slowly dwindling or quickly dwindling.
One thing, like in those sort of like occupation situations, which was always like great, there was quite a few office occupations during the strike. And one thing that was always really great and sort of reinvigorated things was, I know I think you haven't already, but like calling a citywide solidarity rally outside of the occupation, right? Like, and so if all these groups are saying they want to help out and they want to give suggestions and they want to like be involved, what they should actually do maybe is mobilize and have a rally that they all organize in the square there and like invite everybody, you know, like next Friday or something. I don't know how long it seems that this is going to happen. I guess it's sort of up to you. So maybe, you know, people feel it's urgent, like in the left, like people in Montreal are even asking me about what's going on here and stuff. And I think, you know, there would be a significant response if you said, you know, to New Yorkers, like, come and support free education, come and support the union, and, you know, this courageous action that's taking place, because it is courageous. And, you know, and get the end there and film and et cetera. You know, like that. And maybe, I think, whatever struggles and tensions you're having internally, they're very important. I'm sure I don't have any idea of what they are, but there's always those similar things that exist. But often, you know, when you're reminded that there's actually support and larger context and ideas that are driving this action, those things seem not unimportant, but more possible to address. You know? But I think what you're all doing is amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like last semester, it was both actions have been both strategically and unstrategically near the end of the semester, which works to disrupt the administration, but then also disrupts obviously student work and people are finishing right now. Still today, like one of the last days, people are finishing papers and work, and then a lot of students, because this was like kind of in a shorter term, to begin with, had to leave the city, and so it's like those few days in the beginning, which was like over a week ago now, that we were able to have a meeting because everyone was still here, and the sense of urgency, even though maybe it's more urgent now, the sense of urgency then was we were able to bring out many more people, and then it's like it just since maybe last Monday or this past Monday, it just seems like it's never the right time to call for a meeting because unlike the beginning of the occupation, you know, people are going to be absent who want to come to the meeting, and so it seems that because of that, we just stopped having meetings. And I think again, like also like we stopped calling them meetings because like that was adverse to some people, so we just calling them like conversations. So then instead of like, you know, it doesn't work for us to really have those meetings or conversations in this room. It was very hard with the guard present. The guards weren't listening to what we were saying, so we started doing it in the lobby, and then I think it's just like from there, very like kind of thing very quickly fell off with that, and then like yeah, I don't think it would be. I think something like a rally could really help with the momentum. I think very soon speaking with the faculty could help us, and I think there are like just a few other pieces that could really help bolster what we're doing, because it's like a lot of what we're doing has has to do what other people will have to do. So it's like there's kind of this waiting on both ends, and something needs to instigate something else so that other doors can be made open. And right now it seems like there are a lot of like partially open doors, and it's very hard with like the number of people to like get fully into those spaces without completely losing what we have left, which is like a much smaller group than when we started.
Well, another thing that came to my mind, which is that you guys are in New York City, which is like, I don't know how many, I'm not gonna even try and guess, but like, in terms of like figures and recognized people on the left who live here, it's like thousands, right? So, you know, I just, you know, another thing other than the rally is also like a declaration that people can sign on to. I don't know if you've done something like that, or you know, people like, I don't know, people are telling me to us here that I didn't know before, but like, you know, I mean, whatever, I'm not gonna get into names, but you know, like, you know, like if you can get like a whole bunch of people, like, you know, whatever, like the very obvious ones, like Chomsky, etc., to support what you're doing, and I'm sure they do. If you can even just have 25 or 30, you know, to Graver, etc., Amy Goodman, etc., just issuing a very basic declaration that outlines why they support you, and it also sort of blows open the attempts by this administration to sort of say, oh, what you're doing is immature, you don't really understand what's going on. Like, there's people like, you know, who are very respected in the academic sphere, they might be radical. Also, like, that could be a good thing to consider.
It's a really good idea.
Yeah, I think that's
Because we've already been in contact with like some of those people. Yeah.
right now the only thing that we have that people could sign is like the no confidence, but I think that limits it to like students, alumni, and like maybe parents. And, like for outside people to sign something either to that effect or some sort of other more broad declaration would be good, because like they can, I think this was like this first thing we had was very specific to the community.
Yeah.
Because the chairman and the board are always talking about how we don't, if this group does not have community support, or how we're just a small number of current students, or whatever they're trying to say. So we need to do like the community thing, but I think we've made it very clear how many people in the community are with us, and now maybe we do have to do like a more, like you're saying, academic,
Like profiles.
yeah, declaration or something.
You could
Writing.
announce it at the rally.
Yeah.
And if you have a rally, I know you guys all seem really tired. I get it. You're sustaining something already that's like super awesome.
But I also I'm just like I've been thinking about just being aware of like our internal stuff, because in my experience people outside, like guys on this kind of thing, aren't, maybe they don't have enough of like the story that we want, like it's too simplistic, but they're also not aware of these like day-to-day problems, like oh my god, is the group gonna like hold together, or like are we getting like paranoid about like security or like whatever, like those are all really hard ways to ride in here, or like people feel like they're gonna drop off, or but I think in terms of public stuff, like it has been moving along in a pretty good way, like in terms of like the way that like Justin Weeds articulated like what we're doing in his blog post, where like what we're facing is like things that we want have been rebranded as things that we're not supposed to have. But then also people like Felix which is like a broader ideological thing, but then also people like Felix who are really acutely targeting like the board, and like Victoria on Democracy Now. So I think it's another part is just like taking care of ourselves too. It's hard, and also realizing that like we don't always have to be on. Like so much of what's impressive to me about the union model stuff is that it seems so rigorous, when I feel like we're kind of like ad hoc. But I think just by like staying here, that stuff also has moved along, like generally like with my expectations so far. So
lot of the specific, the confidence is mapping what you're against. And I think it's really important to also have communications out for how people sign on to what you're for, which is this much larger systemic thing. It isn't just about like who's president of the union, which a lot of people in the city don't relate to because they don't know the players of this specific institution. But to say that this is like free tuition and to talk about kind of the wider, and this is obviously a conversation that's happened a lot, but to push it in a way that is outside of Cooper, to say like the founding principles of the school were really different from a lot of, from what is the paradigm now. And the founding institutions of Cooper were actually not quite, but more similar. Like CUNY had more similar politics at a time back when education was free and SUNY school systems. I went to Purchase College and we had a very similar thing. In the beginning we didn't have grades or tuition. And then slowly over 10, 15 years got repealed. But understanding that a lot of institutions, their founding ideas were based on a much greater good for people that is currently being provided is something I think a lot of people can relate to. And a lot of people who don't even know what the Cooper Union campaign is at least understand that what education, accessible education is fundamental for like a healthy society. So I think that positioning can help kind of be one of the kickstarters for a larger movement, while at the same time providing direct support for this institutional campaign.
You don't have to look at that sort of history data like this.
What was this?
We have like a few, like the history of news school, the history of no, like the history of like like actually institutions that at their foundations are based on some sort of progressive ideas. We have a few that were founded during that period of upheaval, which are more traditional universities. But yeah, so there are some, but there's a lot of work. It's crazy.
Just also to tap into one of the reasons I'm here today is to do burnout prevention stuff, which I want to get to at some point. I'm not sure exactly when to do that. To me, it works better when it's the kind of like it's the end of a work day, so people can kind of marinate with it, or at least to the end of like a long cycle. And ideally, it's like as many people the more people come, the more people it will help kind of stabilize. So we can have that conversation now. We can have that conversation in a little bit. We can have a more general one now and have a more specific, intimate go around later. I'm really open to whatever we want to do. I can stick around today. So just like saying that is the thing that I'm here to do, and that can happen at any point. This is a really important conversation. I think that this is sort of part of that debrief in some ways, in more of an action way, but like it kind of helps us feel rooted when we realize that there's other people outside of a specific campaign. Maybe addressing development might be an important piece of this conversation that can both work. And I think that might be the bridge between these two conversations is what has happened historically in other places and how those models could be here, but what's preventing that. And then maybe later on we can delve more specifically into like the personals of how we're feeling and what's making us feel powerful and what is like making us feel disempowered.
Yeah, I don't think there's gonna be like an ideal time period. I think you can set a time. Like unfortunately there's like no end of work day. Like I like barely got to start the work that I said I would do today. Like I usually end up working like into the night. Some people are like working now, so it's not like one work day. It's like he's talking about like the ad hoc, which is I think works in some ways, but I think also doesn't work because there is no it removes that end of work day that you're talking about. Like there is no end of just like some people are starting to sleep when other people are waking up, and it's like because of that it's like a continual rolling of like things happen when some people aren't here, and then come back and they have to find out about the things. So it's like I think instead of waiting, I think like if you can say like 2:39 now, and if you want to take a look at like a half hour or
you so much.
Talk later today.
So, it's
Yeah, it was really good.
meeting you all. Tangentially speaking, if you want, I don't know how, I can either help draft the external solidarity statement or I can help contact people.
Probably both. And like, we also, I don't think I know her last name, but someone named Emily from Ase is coming tomorrow also. So maybe if we connect the two of you on email, and then like that would be really good, and I think that would help. That would also like every time you get like a solidarity message or statement or something, it really helps people a lot. And I think like that would be like really big for people to feel that.
But also I think that solidarity statements from like well-known New Yorkers would be useful. And then I can get some few people from Canada to sign it, like Naomi Klein. So that'd be really good. But it's been a pleasure being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for fun.
Nice meeting you all.
Thank you.